Finally, we reach task 7, setting up your development environment. So the aims of this task are to really give you an introduction to the new tools you're going to be using in the development process going forward, and to get you set up with the foundation of your project so you can actually start sprinting and developing. So some of the things you're going to have to do to complete this task are install an IDE, set up a local repository, connect that local code repository to a remote code repository, make your first commit, and make your first deployment, aka hello world. Now, if a lot of that didn't make sense, that's fine, because we are moving out of the comfort zone here. We are going from being a programmer to a developer, and that involves a lot of new knowledge, a lot of new tools. So I'm going to go through all of those right now, step by step, just to give you an idea of what's required by this. So the first one I mentioned was an IDE, or an integrated development environment. So an integrated development environment is software to make software, right? You've probably heard of lots of, anywhere you're coding, any kind of platform like that is a kind of IDE. Now it's integrated because it helps you run the code, test the code, push out the code, do all these things. My choice for Java is IntelliJ IDEA. My choice for Python is PyCharm, but there's a lot of other popular ones out there, like I've written here Eclipse and NetBeans, and a lot of online ones like Replit. So take your pick. Depending on what tutorial you see online, they might be using a different IDE. My tutorials, though, I'll be using something by either IntelliJ IDEA for Java or PyCharm for Python. Version control and repositories. So you will need to initialize a repository and connect it with a remote repository. What does that mean? Well, we're talking about version control. Code repositories are places for you to store your code and create commits, which you can think of as save points. This is really useful if you ever need to roll back any changes. And what that means is, you create a save point, and then everything's working great. You like where your code is, and you're going to do the next thing, and you start coding, and you realize that your software doesn't work anymore. Oops. So you're worse off than you were. Well, if you didn't have any save points, you would have to try to undo everything you did, and maybe that's not possible. But if you have something like a commit, a repository that tracks all of the kind of snapshots of your code, it's much easier to roll back. Okay, so this is the reason why we commit our code. So there's various ways of tracking your code. The choice that we're going to use, and very popular on the internet, is a language called Git. And I'll get into it in just a second. But anything else you need to know about Git is it's not just used by one platform. Many platforms use it. There's different terms associated with it, like branch. So you could see there, I have branch, I have commit, push, pull, request, merge. I'm going to make a separate video outlining all these concepts. What you need to know, though, is Git is very useful if you want to be a developer, a professional, right? This is an industry standard. Lots of people use it, and it's essential if multiple people are working on code, because otherwise it's just very difficult to track all the changes, who did what and this. But like I said, I'll make a separate video on that. All right, we will be using GitHub to store our repositories. So Git is the language, and GitHub is the service we're using. So what you'll need to do to complete this task is you will start your coding project. from scratch, or you'll use a boilerplate. So meaning I'll provide you with some code, or your teacher in general will provide you with some code. And from that code, you can then kind of have an up and running project. After you start, so you have that code on your computer, and you'll initialize a Git repository. And that means you're making those save points just locally on your machine. The next step then is to link that Git repository, your local repository, with one online on, for example, GitHub. Now, GitHub, as I said, isn't the only game in town. There's also GitLab. It's a slightly different platform, but it's there. The one I will be providing you, though, is a very particular link, and it's using GitHub Classroom. So so if you're on using an IDE and it'll say, do you want to publish your changes? Do you want to publish your project? You don't publish it. Instead, I'll show you in a separate tutorial, actually in a bit, how to link these projects together. Okay, your local one and the repository. I'm giving you a repository for you to use online. Yeah. Then once you're coding, once you're producing all the different, you're making your project, you should be prepared to commit your code regularly. That means create save points often where you're able to kind of update your code, and where you update your code and you push it to the web. And that's a way for me to check on your progress as well. As a note, if you ever want me to look at your code, I will not look at it on your computer. I will only look at it from GitHub, meaning you push your code to the internet, I will download it on my machine, and I'll look at it from there. It's happened many times where student says a code doesn't work on their machine. I bring it onto my machine, works fine. At that point, we know it's not the code, but something else, right? Okay, command line interface, or a CLI. A CLI is an essential tool for any programmer, right? In Mac, this is called a terminal. In Windows, it's often referred to as the shell or just the command line. IDEs, such as IntelliJ IDEA or PyCharm, have terminals built into them. So when I'm developing, you'll get a chance to see. That's probably the one I'm going to use. You'll probably be asked to use a CLI right from the get-go on your project. Any tutorial you follow, even setting up your project, is probably going to involve a CLI. All right. The easiest way to handle anything on the command line is to just search out tutorials and follow them. And those tutorials, of course, are YouTube tutorials, but a lot of great documentation is provided by framework developers and as such, so you could just follow written instructions as well. Secret to getting better is to practice using the command line. I don't think I'm really going to be making much of a introductory video. You kind of just learn things as you go along. One more point before I move on to the next item is be careful with the sudo command, right? And you might say, what's the sudo? That's super user do. If you type something in, like delete my entire hard drive with sudo, and then you say, yes, I'm sure I want to do it, then it's gone, right? So be very careful when you implement something with the sudo command, because it could be dangerous for you, for your machine. Okay, finally, so after you find your IDE, you set up your code repository, I'm going to ask you to deploy your code for the first time. This is your hello world, like just a basic deployment. So this really depends on what product you're developing. If you're developing a web app, then you deploy on a server. Deployment for a desktop-based app just means kind of compiling the code and making an executable file, right? So a package, a .jar file, and if you compile Java code, .exe if you're making something in Windows, something along those lines, right? So this is a big step, and we're not waiting to the end to do this. We're going to be doing it at the end of every sprint. You're going to be deploying we call deploying to production, right? We're going to be deploying something at the end of every sprint just so you can kind of show off what you're doing, right? So please get comfortable with this early on and get used to it. So if you are, as I mentioned, if you're doing a web app, you are going to be deploying your web app to a server. Now, I think a lot of you will probably be doing web apps because if you want your software to be shared with anyone, well, then really web apps are the way to go. There's two I recommend, right? One is Heroku, which is good for everything, right? And they're pretty popular. They're pretty well known. They have a free account that just lets you do the very basic stuff that we want to do for our project like this. It's more than sufficient for our needs. Another platform I really like is called Python Anywhere. And just as the name suggests, you can set up a little Python app anywhere, meaning on the internet, right? So those are the two I'm going to be referring to. I'm going to be making some videos accompanying this overview, and so probably for my Java-based version of my app, I'm gonna deploy it in Heroku, and for the Python-based one, I'm probably going to choose Python Anywhere. Although I could probably choose Heroku as well. We'll see. I'll cross that bridge when I get to it. So when you do all those steps, you will be finished. But right now, let's not jump the gun now. Let's go ahead and do those steps.